Money was not always metal or paper. It could be shell beads, a stone unseen on the Pacific floor, or a handwritten ledger carried into a Geneva bank. Some forms of wealth survived empires. Others vanished when rules changed. One account stayed locked for 52 years after an heir was asked for a document no death camp could provide. The shell money crash. A string of shell beads, 6 feet long and strung on deer sinew cord, was money real enough to trade for furs on a cold dock on the Hudson River. In 1637, the Massachusetts Bay Colony made these beads, called wampum, legal payment alongside coin. Early beads were ground and drilled by hand, one at a time, work slow enough to limit how many entered circulation. European traders wanted wampum fast enough to buy furs at scale, so they brought steel awls and hand drills built for speed, and production climbed through the 1640s and 50s. In 1641, a Dutch gilder bought 80 white beads. By 1658, it took 224, nearly 3 times as many over 17 years. Picture a jar of 100 handmade tokens tripled in number while the goods they buy stay the same. Each token buys a third of what it used to. A Muncie trader who had banked a season of trade in wampum watched the same string buy less bread, less cloth, less of everything he needed. In 1661, the Massachusetts court stripped wampum of its legal status. The colonists who had flooded the market to buy furs cheap were left holding beads nobody wanted and too little silver coin to replace them. The treasure nobody reclaimed. Sometime after 407, a wealthy Roman-British household packed roughly 60 pounds of gold and silver into an oak chest in Suffolk. The owner and the exact reason for burial are unknown. Rome had just told Britain to defend itself, and burying valuables was common as the province's administration collapsed around it. The packing was careful, not panicked. Coins in leather bags, silver wrapped for protection, small locks fitted to the inner boxes, the kind of care that suggests someone expected to come back. In November 1992, retired electricity worker Eric Laws carried a metal detector into that same field, searching only for a friend's lost hammer. The machine gave a strong signal, and Laws knelt in the mud to find silver spoons stacked together and gold coins barely tarnished after 15 centuries underground. He stopped digging, reported the find that same day, and let archaeologists excavate the site under controlled conditions. What came out of the ground totaled nearly 15,000 coins and 200 silver and gold objects. Among them, a silver pepper pot shaped like a Roman noblewoman, built to dispense spice imported from India. The hoard was valued at £1.75 million in 1993, close to £4.5 million in today's money. Laws split the reward evenly with farmer Peter Watling, on whose land he'd been searching. The lost hammer turned up too during the dig, and now sits in the British Museum near the gold it helped uncover. His decision to stop digging and report immediately became a model cited when Parliament wrote the Treasure Act 4 years later, the law that still decides who owns what a British field gives back. The fortune on the ocean floor. A raft of lashed logs strained against the waves off the Yap Islands, hauling a disc cut from calcite quarried on Palau at enormous human cost. A storm broke over the crew, and to save their own lives, they cut the ropes. The stone, taller than a man and weighing several tons, went down and stayed on the seafloor for good. When the survivors reached Yap, they swore before the whole village that the stone had been flawless and that the loss was no fault of the family that owned it. The island's answer still puzzles outsiders. Ownership stood. Nobody needed to see the stone to accept its value. Everyone on Yap already recognized which family owned it, the same way a household ledger can record a debt that survives even after the paper itself is lost, as long as everyone who owes and everyone who's owed still agrees on the number. In 1903, American ethnographer William Henry Furness recorded the story from his guide, a Yap Islander named Fatumak, and published it 7 years later. The debt the stone represented was never written down. It lived only in what an entire island was willing to remember out loud, a system that worked until outside supply made memory cheaper to fake. A captain named David O'Keefe began hauling rye stones home using iron tools and powered ships, and the eased supply wore down the value that scarcity and risk had once given the older stones. A bowl full of continents. Metal detectorist David Whelan and his son Andrew were sweeping a Yorkshire pasture in January 2007 when their machine caught something heavy about a foot down. A silver bowl slid loose from the dirt, and coins and broken silver spilled out as it struck the ground. Father and son stopped digging at once, covered the hole, and called the authorities before the site could be disturbed. What they had found was a Viking Age hoard buried around 927, during the unrest that followed King Athelstan's conquest of Northumbria. Inside a gilded 9th century church cup wrapped in lead, archaeologists counted 617 coins and 65 other objects. Silver hacked into trade-weight pieces, a gold arm ring, and coins struck as far away as Samarkand and as close as Ireland. In 2009, the Independent Treasure Valuation Committee priced the hoard at £1.082 million, worth close to double that today. Vikings buried this hoard, but its coins and silver had already passed through Islamic, Christian, and pagan hands from Afghanistan to Ireland before ending up under a Yorkshire pasture. Proof that raiding coexisted with a trade network spanning 3 continents. Whoever buried that cup during Athelstan's campaign never came back to dig it up. Prove your father is dead. 52 years passed before one Swiss account moved. In the late 1930s, Warsaw banker Josef Sapir deposited large sums, at times as much as £20,000, at a Credit Suisse branch in Geneva, worth well over £1 million today. He was murdered at the Mygenette concentration camp in 1943. His daughter Estelle survived the camps, and by 1947 she stood at that same Geneva branch with her father's original deposit slip. The bank did not deny the account existed. It asked for an official death certificate instead. Proof no concentration camp had ever issued. For decades, that single requirement was the whole answer. Estelle later pointed out that the men who killed her father had left behind no such paperwork, and the bank knew it as well as she did. Nothing moved until 1997, when New York's Attorney General and State Comptroller, backed by a senator, threatened to challenge Swiss Bank's ability to operate in New York State. Credit Suisse settled with Estelle Sapir in May 1998 for an undisclosed sum reported near $500,000, worth close to $1 million today. 3 months later, Swiss banks agreed to a broader fund covering Holocaust-era accounts, worth $1.25 billion in total. The currency they erased. Across West African markets, small white cowrie shells had circulated as money for centuries. Imported from the Maldives along long, difficult trade routes, they backed debts, dowries, and daily trade across Dahomey and the Niger Delta long before European ships reached the coast. In 1849, the Hamburg trading house William Oswald and Company opened an agency on Zanzibar and began shipping a similar East African shell west by the boatload. A coastal trader who had spent years banking his savings in cowries watched their price fall as the new shells reached every market at once. By the turn of the century, the volume of shells needed to carry real value had grown so heavy that moving a modest sum required hiring porters just to carry the weight. In 1911, British colonial administrators in northern Nigeria formally withdrew cowries as payment for taxes and dues, forcing communities to earn and pay in colonial currency instead. The shells were not simply outcompeted, they were priced out by a flood of new supply, then written out of law by the same governments that had encouraged the flood in the first place. A granary built against famine. Rows of wooden grain bins stood along the frontier of Han China, filled and emptied on the orders of a minister named Gang Shouchang. In 54 BCE, he convinced Emperor Xuan to buy grain when it was cheap and sell it below market price when it turned scarce, a buffer meant to keep small farmers out of the hands of speculators. Officials weighed the incoming rice and millet on standardized bronze scales, and the scales themselves became a kind of promise that the state would step in before a bad harvest turned into a famine. Historian Ban Gu later summarized the idea in the Book of Han. When grain was cheap, the state bought it high. When grain was expensive, it sold low. For years, the arrangement held prices steadier than the open market alone could have. Decades later, floods struck the Guangdong region, and grain prices spiked past 300 coins for a single measure, a jump historians compare to a family's monthly grain budget multiplying several times over in a single season. Historians still debate whether that crisis exposed a flaw in the granary system itself, or simply a disaster large enough to overwhelm any buffer. What is certain is that critics at the time turned on the very institution built to prevent famine, arguing that a granary strong enough to stabilize prices was also strong enough to manipulate them. A ticket that wasn't enough. In 1894, 13-year-old Mary Anton crossed the Russian frontier with her mother and siblings, traveling to join her father, who had already reached Boston. The family carried little beyond a steamer ticket and a passport. At the border crossing of Verzbolovo, officials told them their ticket wasn't valid for the class they needed and demanded payment they didn't have, roughly 200 rubles, worth several $1,000s today. Until it was paid, the family's passport stayed in a stranger's hands, and their journey stopped at a desk. Anton later wrote of the fear that trailed her family at every stage of the crossing. Officers and soldiers treated less like officials to satisfy than a danger to survive. The family reached Boston, and years afterward, Anton's memoir, The Promised Land, turned that crossing into one of the clearest accounts on record of what refugees carried west, and what a single unpaid difference at a border desk could cost a family that had almost made it out. A city built from money. Ibn Battuta expected a trading post in the Sahara. He found a town built out of its own currency. The Moroccan traveler crossed the desert to Tagaza in 1352 and wrote that its houses and even its mosque were built from blocks of salt, roofed only with camel skins, in a place so dry the walls never dissolved. Enslaved Masufa laborers mined that salt and depended entirely on caravans hauling in dates and millet from hundreds of miles away, sitting on a fortune they could not eat and could not drink. A single camel load of salt brought 8 to 10 mithqals of gold at the trading town of Iwalatan. Carried further, to the capital of the Mali Empire, the same load sold for 20 to 40 mithqals, the price climbing with every mile it survived without cracking apart in the damp or falling to raiders. In today's gold prices, that range runs from roughly $3,000 to well over $10,000 for a single load of salt. Salt never outweighed gold ounce for ounce. Caravans that lost their cargo to raiders or rain lost it completely. Salt dissolved, and with it went a fortune that had survived every mile of the desert but one. 16 years for one answer. On July 20th, 1985, a radio message from the salvage boat Dauntless ended Mel Fisher's 16-year search. The Spanish galleon Nuestra Señora de Atocha had gone down in a hurricane off the Florida Keys in 1622, taking gold, silver, copper, and emeralds with it. Fisher, a former chicken farmer turned treasure hunter, had spent 16 years fighting the ocean and, for long stretches, the United States government's claim to whatever he found. The search cost him more than money. On July 20th, 1975, exactly 10 years earlier, his son Dirk, Dirk's wife Angel, and diver Rick Gage drowned when their search boat capsized. Fisher kept looking. A decade later to the day, his other son Kane radioed that divers had swum into a wall of blackened silver bars. "Put away the charts," Kane told him. "We've got the mother lode." They had located roughly 40 tons of silver and gold, and more than 114,000 silver coins, valued at the time near $450 million, worth well over $1 billion today. The ocean that took Fisher's son on July 20th gave back a fortune on the same date 10 years later. A coincidence confirmed by the crew's own log and explained by nothing but the calendar. If you know a story about wealth that outlived the person who hid it, leave it in the comments and subscribe for the next one.